Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Nick, and I help direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into tonight's event with Dacre Montgomery, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass-Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight we are excited to have with us Australian actor and poet Dacre Montgomery Harvey. He is primarily known for his portrayals of Jason Lee Scott in Power Rangers and Billy Hargrove in Stranger Things. His podcast, titled DKMH, was released in 2019, rose to the top of podcast charts with over 800,000 plays, and features his poetry paired with music from 150 talented musicians from across the world. His poetry is an expression of what drives him, what scares him, what gets him up in the morning. Universal, instinctive, and deep, Montgomery's words touch hearts and minds across the globe. Joining Dacre in conversation tonight is the Director of Events at Strand Bookstore, Sabir Sultan. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dacre Montgomery and Sabir Sultan to the stage.
Hey there. How you doing? Hey, Sabir. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. How's your day been?
Oh, it's been fantastic. It's just starting over here. How about you? Are you what time is it over in New
Just
York?
7 p.m. But I should say, since we
7
have people
p.m.
from all over, who knows what time?
I know everyone's coming from different time zones. I appreciate everyone who's on this taking the time, and you especially, Sabir. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I cannot wait to start discussing DKMH. So I think a great place to begin might be if you, in your introduction, you talk about the
Yep.
roundabout way poetry's entered your life. And it would be great if you could walk us and the audience through your journey. How did you start
Yeah.
writing? Yeah.
Totally. No. Well, it was definitely a roundabout sort of way. I had never written. I did terrible in English. Like my sort of your typical association maybe with poetry, or at least for me, was well, you have to learn spelling and grammar, and it's a very technical thing. And I never perceived it to be an artistic outlet, a way of dealing with what was happening in my life. And about 3.5 years ago, I don't know. I just remember I was going through a lot of things, good and bad, but just heightened emotional states sort of led me to start exploring words one day at my parents' house in the afternoon. And I got onto my laptop and I started just sort of writing stream of consciousness into the Pages app on my MacBook. And so just sort of writing gobbledygook, just spitting it all onto the page and listening to just sort of white noise. And I'd never done it before. And I used to get anxious. I still do get anxious. I mean, as human beings, we cope with all different kinds of emotions, but my outlets were different. It was never writing. So I sort of sat down and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and a lot of it didn't make sense, but I started to feel better. I started to feel like for the first time, this sort of weight was lifting, as is any sort of artistic endeavor, you know, whether it's acting or painting or playing music. Often for an artist, it's an outlet. And for me, acting had been that outlet, but you're not always fortunate enough to be able to do what you love. And yeah, so I started writing and it just poured out of me. And I just remember feeling really emotional. Like it wasn't necessarily a good or a bad thing, but I was just crying. I was just upset and I was writing. And that first poem I wrote, I mean, as I said, there was a lot of stuff in the periphery that was gobbledygook, really, in the first thing. But the first poem I wrote was In Vitro. And my mother, I've spoken about this a little bit, but my mother works in mental health, perinatal, women's mental health. So especially with women and babies experiencing like postnatal depression. So after they give birth, they're struggling a lot with mental health issues. And she had brought an amazing story of a mother and a son to me. And the mother was a 35-year-old woman who was a virgin and had been artificially inseminated and given birth to a baby boy via cesarean section. So essentially, that child is like the son of the Virgin Mary in modern context. So in my first poem, I wanted to extrapolate the complicated dynamic between mother and son. If that was the only intimate relationship that she had ever had, in many ways it would be extremely complicated. And I wanted to know how he would fall in love. So my first poem, In Vitro, is about how that child would see the world and how the world would see him. And in some ways it was even fictionalizing her story on the page, which had nothing to do with my story or my life. I somehow seemed to get out all of these things that I needed to get out off my chest. Anger, love. I was falling in love at the time, and I needed to, I don't know, almost use this fictional guy's story of a complicated relationship with his mother to figure out what I was going through in my life.
Oh, no, that's fascinating because a lot of your poetry, and we can get into it later as you'll be reading, but you deal so frankly with like anxiety, depression, love, that I'm always curious or I am curious how you maintain that sort of boundary between like your public self, this like famous actor, and this private self who's sharing their feelings on the page. Like, is that
Well, I think, yeah, no, I think it's definitely like, when you're in public, it's just like a mask, right? So I'm a different version of myself with you and with this audience than I am with my mother, than I am with my partner. And that public versus private self, which I think is what you're talking about, is a very important definition to create in your life, especially if you are in the public eye. It's important to have both because then you're safe emotionally in your life. And I think for me, the podcast and then ultimately this book has been a really nice outlet to share with the world my private self in a way that still feels safe, if that makes sense.
it does?
So, yeah, so that there's a differentiation, but it is still private self, I think.
Well, I'm glad you touched upon your podcast because one of the things I was curious about, and for those of you in the audience who aren't familiar with the podcast, it's DKMH, same title as the book. You can download it on Apple, Spotify, etc., all of the main places. But on that podcast, you're reading your poetry set to a variety of music. And so
Mm-hmm.
another thing I was curious about was which sort of came first, the podcast or the collection? Did you know the collection was going to come one day?
No, the podcast definitely came first, but the writing, which ultimately is this, in its truest form, which is actually split up into a whole lot of different poems, came first. And I had been writing for a year and a half or so. And then I think it was my mom or my partner that said, why don't you, because I was always speaking it, why don't you speak it to music? And I was kind of thinking Gil Scott Heron, like a beat poet, like what is that version? And because I'm not a singer, I don't like to sing. Like I'm not a rapper. What is this version? What is Dacre's version? And oddly enough, I adopted this American accent, which I had been using in my work, and I started recording myself speaking various different pieces of my poetry in an American accent. And then when it came to music, I was like, this is going to be such a hard thing for me to describe to musicians. If I start going out to musicians and saying, can you compose a piece of music? You're a lyricist, you're an artist, you sing, but I want you to do an instrumental. So I approached Julia Stone from Angus and Julia Stone, who I had worked with on a video clip in Mexico for the Chateau song, a year and a half, 2 years prior. But we'd stayed in touch, and I reached out to her and Angus, and I sort of said, look, I have this weird, wacky idea, but I want to do a season, and I want to start going out to musicians to help me produce it. Would you be so generous enough to do the first track, which was Spaghetti, and make it almost a demo? Because I know they're both so talented. And I said, look, if you have the time, would this be something that you could do? Anyway, so I'm not even kidding you. A week passes and Julia hits me back. I've sent her my track, Spaghetti. I've recorded it in Perth at home in Australia. And I send it to her and she sends me this track back. There's no edit. The track that is Spaghetti that lives on the podcast is her first pass at it. She's singing these beautiful harmonies. She plays every instrument under the sun. So she's playing all the instruments on the track. And that became the life to this thing, which had been an outlet. It suddenly just burst with life and color. And I used that demo to go out to the 150 musicians or however many people on social media and say, here's the demo. I've got a track that I want to work with you on. Would you be interested in producing the musical side of things? And it just, over the next 8-9 months, it just blossomed, and we made contact with people all over the world. I worked with an amazing gentleman in Sweden who recorded every single orchestral component to an orchestra and onto a cassette deck tape and mailed it to my producer in Perth. Like just amazing things that are incredibly special. I worked with a guy who goes by the name of Jazz Enough, and he's an amazing pianist, but he does like these beautiful beat landscapes of almost like house music. And he's based out of Brooklyn in New York. So there suddenly was all these people coming out of the woodwork that were happy to sort of collaborate and get involved. And to me, that really gave me more confidence than I had to kind of start stepping in this direction, I think.
And like speaking of that direction and like your sort of like collaborative spirit, I find the cover image of that book just so
Oh, thank you.
mesmerizing. Yeah. If you could.
Thanks. Well, yeah. Well, it's funny because anecdotally, there is a crossover because a gentleman called David Stenbeck that goes by the name Dove Neon, his artist name, he did this cover work, but he was the first person I reached out to for DKMH podcast season 1. He did all of the artworks of the perfume bottles. And he's an amazing graphic artist and designer and poet himself. And he created all the imagery for season 1. And a lot of the people did. I mean, everyone did this pro bono in season 1. Like everyone just came and helped out. And so it was my mission, obviously, to see them at some point get paid for something. So when we were going down this route, my first thought was, how do we get David paid? Like, how do we get Dove Neon to get paid for the magnificent work he did really in season 1 of the podcast for me for this, and have it live on the cover. Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I'm curious, how do you see that cover as just sort of an entryway to the book? Because it's so striking. There's not much text. It's the art which grabs your eye and pulls you in.
Well, I think probably in 2 parts. I mean, at the back of the book, I have a little author's note about the artist. And at the bottom here, I say, I love David's use of bold colors, which I'll come back to because obviously we're playing the antithetical because it's in black and white here. But Smoke and Neon, he brings the idea of magic realism to life. And I love his power of magic and suggestion. And now he has brought this power to my book, sheltered it with his creativity, and crafted a portal to the imagination. And I think that's the thing, is that his imagery, he takes photos of the moon, for example, and then he layers in these beautiful, almost science fiction kind of elements. Like I say, this sort of magical realism. But all of his work is bold color. So what I wanted to do was use this idea of magic realism as a portal into, this image could really be whatever Sabir or anyone in the audience thinks they want it to be. I didn't want it to tell the audience how to feel about the book. But then I also wanted to strip the color away so that it was something that somebody could sort of endow with meaning in their own color and their own context, and just have the the letters be, this is the color we took from this original picture, if that makes sense. So we took the color from this original picture, which is in color, and just left it through there, through the letters. But his work is just amazing, and it needed to be the portal, into this book for me.
That makes perfect sense because it's allowing the reader to project themselves into the book, which is what any great poetry collection does.
Yeah, well, and I'm very fortunate that he has been so generous with his time and spirit.
Well, from the Strand, we thank you too.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then on that note, why don't we do a bit of readings? I know,
Yeah, totally.
yeah, for the audience, just to walk you through it, we're gonna do a couple of poems from each section, and now Dacre's going to begin reading from the first section.
Awesome. Well, actually, I thought I could start just with the back and then the
Yes.
front flap, if that works well. Just because this
Yeah.
actually was never, this poem in two parts, the back cover and the front flap, was never in the book. And it was a poem that I plan to release in, a tiny part of a poem I plan to release in future seasons of the podcast and hopefully books. Again, don't wig out, but I do like to do my American accent. I don't want to be that guy, but it's something that's, I guess, always happened with reading my poetry. But yeah, I'll read the back here. So I say, like an egg, top to bottom, try and break me, it won't work. I have strength rooted in my core, but hit the sides and you'll watch the yolk ooze out of me like molten lava. You too will become porous. And then on the inside, I say, porous pumice, each indent like a freckle, like cheese. Some cheese you can see right through. If I was looking, I might be able to see through you. So that's kind of how I wanted to, I don't know, pose it, bring the audience in, bring them into, to that world, I guess, of magic realism and of suggestion and of vulnerability more than anything. And I think that idea of being able to see through someone is like that private and public mask that I was talking about earlier. We all present different sides of ourselves to the world. We all act every day in our jobs, in our relationships. We always do stuff like that. And I think the important thing about this book for me is about sensitivity, about vulnerability. And I've also talked a lot about in the past, I know I'm gonna keep going, but I have talked a lot in the past about growing up as a male. There's a lot of connotations that masculinity and sensitivity are not synonymous.
100%.
And that perturbs me, to be quite honest. And growing up, I think my gift in life was to own my sensitivity and own my feelings. And that's what this is. And I think it's an opportunity to open up and look through, like I say, the pumice, the cheese, a freckle, every indent, everything that makes us who we are is so important to own for ourselves and for everyone else around us. So I don't know, Sabir, do you want me to sort of read a bit of the introduction? I have the quote that I sort of open with, which is interesting, and then there's obviously the introduction, which is quite lengthy. So I don't know if do you want me to read both or a bit of each?
I think a bit of each would be great.
Perfect.
For the audience, you're gonna love it. So
Awesome. Well, so basically, the book begins with a tiny little sort of quote at the front here. So I'm just going to start by reading that about the book. This, the minutia, my life. I am a stallion, bipolar. I just reached contact with a lost nation, another person, a different relation, a different time and a different patience. As if I've cried in a dream, woken up screaming, and then settled in the sheets. I find both connection and softness, a lost tension, now tempered, with aged awareness. So that's sort of the intro, I guess, or the opening quote. So the intro is a few pages, Sabir, but I was struggling at home to sort of figure out what I wanted to read before, because really I've touched on a lot of why I sort of came to this world. So I want to sort of see what makes sense after those anecdotes rather.
I would say, I think one
Yeah.
of the,
Sorry, go on.
no, one of the parts of the your introduction I found particularly striking was that period where you were sort of talking about high school and like
Yes.
finding that voice, that vulnerability. I think that's a great entry point for the audience.
Great. Well, yeah, and that's sort of the first half. So I'll read that. So in my own voice. So my entire life, I have felt fragile, overexposed, especially as a child. I felt I had a softness, like I had no shield from the emotional intensity of the world, both in a good way and a bad way. I felt profoundly affected by even the smallest of things, and I suffered from terrible anxiety. And I knew not how to harness this energy. The energy I would later discover was the most powerful and valuable thing in the entire world. When I was younger, I didn't have the outlets that I have today. I lacked work ethic. I didn't play sports or exercise. I had no independence to discover what these feelings meant. Granted, that discovery has manifested itself in different ways over the years. I was a late bloomer. At 17, I discovered alcohol and partying, an outlet I thought would be useful, but time and time again, I found myself anxious the next day, even after one drink. The alcohol dimmed my light, while others chased the feeling of ecstasy through outlets like drugs, drink, and sex. I have always felt like I could achieve that feeling without the aid of substance. In school, I could talk about music and architecture, film and design, and goosebumps would ripple across my skin. I felt like I could self-induce the feeling of ecstasy. Though epiphanies would not come daily until I was older, I felt as though I had a bottomless pit of passion. I would lock myself in my room and watch film after film. I lived my childhood largely through the escapism of cinema. And what I didn't know then, but came to know as manifestation. And my imagination ran wild, and I started to harness this energy. That's sort of how I begin the introduction. I talk a lot about my OCD sort of tendencies, falling in love, melancholia, depression, as you touched on before, all the sorts of things that I discuss in the book. But then I sort of touch here later on writing. I had been reading scripts for 2 years. This is in my professional life, and had become increasingly interested in story structure and words, the beautiful power of description. Some of my favorite writers are gifted with emotional engagement, and they are word wizards, master craftspeople of the art of dicing up the meat of the English language and expertly serving it on platters of tears and joy to the masses. So largely, I was envious of that ability to have that vulnerability, I guess. Anyway, so the very end, for everyone as we dive in, these poems are moments in my life, defining notes I have conducted in my internal orchestra, and I am so pleased to be sharing them with you. They are personal, but I'm sure universal, of what makes me, you, and everyone human. So that's sort of how I guess we dive into the book, and then I don't know if you wanted to touch on it, Sabir, but I had this last minute decision to put in a little playlist to the book. I was very cautious because, much like the cover, I didn't want to tell the audience or the readers how to feel or what to listen to, or how they should digest the work if they're so kind enough to read it. But I did feel it was important to share my experience because I write to largely the sound of like the desert or rain or white noise, but also I have these albums that are a part of my ritual. So for those who don't have the book or are yet to buy it or so on and so forth, I do suggest a little playlist at the start, accompanied by what I see in the morning when I'm listening to X music or Y music in, middle of the day, as in the evening as well. And I think it's important to have some sort of grounding, whether you use that music or not. That is an important part of the experience for me.
It definitely creates like while reading it, I was listening to the soundtrack too, and there's this effect of creating a receptivity to the writing. Like
Yes,
it almost causes you to like zen out a bit and then feel less. It allows you to bring more of yourself to the work and also less of yourself. To like read the
totally.
poems and see how they relate to you, if that makes sense.
Totally. And I also feel like as an artist, collaboration is the most important thing. And I feel even maybe my insecurities as an artist, but my work on its own does not stand up, in the sense that I want to collaborate with people like Sam Collette, who did the illustrations, and David Stenbeck, who did the cover. And I want it to be accompanied by music, as in podcast form and in a book form. My favorite musicians like Nick Drake, who had a quite troubled, bumpy ride in life when he was alive. It's important because I feel like all of it is a collaboration. Making films is a collaborative exercise. You couldn't do it on your own. And maybe I was being a bit cowardly, but in making a book, I was like, I can't just put my words on a page. It has to be a collaboration on every level, because as an artist, I can't make one thing just by myself. It needs to be brought to life by other minds. And I think that's one of the best parts of being an artist is collaboration.
And it reads true. It as there's a obvious influence in your work of sort of like beat poetry, but that like collaborative atmosphere and approach to making art, to reading poetry, to like making music is very on par with the beats. Like it
Totally.
feels like a through line.
Totally. And life as well, all these experiences I'm talking about in some ways are a collaboration. If I'm having an argument with someone, or I'm anxious about something, or I'm falling in love, aren't I really collaborating with that person in many ways?
Yeah.
I've just been reading this other book. I mean, I don't want to push another book, but I've been reading this. I don't know if anyone else has been reading this. It's Lana Del Rey's new sort of work, and it's interesting because even as she pedals away on her typewriter and the pages have been scanned throughout the book, it is collaborative. Every moment in her life, everything that made her feel unsettled or head over heels or something in love, it's a collaboration with each one of those characters, because they make us who we are. Just like my experiences in childhood being bullied, my partner said to me the other day, would you take any of that back, or your complicated relationships with people in your life? And I said, absolutely not, because it makes us who we are. And they are the collaborations in childhood and
Yeah.
adolescence and adulthood that form us, really. And without that, I wouldn't have been able to write this, because I don't think I would have, there would have, where's the well of material to draw on?
And it's true, those experiences with other people, they shape us. That's who we become is impacted by who we know and who we love.
Totally. Yes. 100%.
Well, and then on that note, why don't you read a couple of poems from the first section for us?
Definitely. So this book is divided into 4 chapters, for those who aren't aware, or 4 sections rather. Fear, love, anxiety, and spirit are sort of the subcategory portals that I invite people to come into. And I did write some down, didn't I? Yeah. Sorry, everyone, bear with. I am. Okay, perfect. So I'll read this one. I'll start reading from the fear chapter. And if you have any questions, or if you want to discuss in between, I can stop in between. Severe. So I say, take it away from me. He. Don't laugh at he. He's human and trying to long and hold and close in and in, inside of you, pouring in. Street light covered from the fog in the night. It's like an egg atop a crown. It fell down and cracked and bent out of shape and began to create something small, crawling and yawning and forming. I growl at it, faint-hearted fool. I growl at you. Let me out of this pool. And then what did we have? Sodium vapor. This is a shorter one here. That sodium vapor, your heart seems safer. Mine is thin like paper, rolls like a thistle, sharpened like a fossil, whittled like a stick, rhubarb crumble, sweet and thick. And then I think that's what I sort of pulled out of the fear chapter, Sabir, for the reading, but I can read it. I mean, how do you want to?
Well, I'd like to leap in with a couple of questions.
Yes, totally.
Yeah, well, I thought what struck me with those two poems and in the fear section in general is how hard the poetic voice is on itself. Like, in terms of those descriptions, you have your heart seems safer, mine is thin like paper, whittled like a stick, rhubarb crumble. The like creature you see coming out of the pool at you in the first one. And I'm curious how those two themes relate to each other. Like fear and sort of self punishment or like self criticism.
Totally. I think you nailed it with the monster kind of image. I think for me, the big differentiation between the fear and the anxiety in the chapters, but also in my life, is that fear feels like a monster that kind of that comes at you, and it drives itself down your throat, and it makes you do things. Like I feel like a lot of things in life are out of fear, right? Everything,
Yeah.
prejudice, all this crap, racism, it's all fear, really. I think for what people do not understand, they do not know. And I think for me, it's always been about unpacking what are my fears in my life. And my fears have been heavily around judgment, about self-worth, about not feeling good enough, not, when I was younger, I was a really big kid. I was really overweight, and my thing was always around an aesthetic about my body and about, how to look. Am I thin? Am I muscly? Am I this? Am I that? It was just a constant thing. And I think fear was rearing its ugly face at me a lot, and still does a lot. And this was just an attempt in this chapter to unpack what is that experience? Like, are you moving through mud? Are you moving through water? Are you moving through sand? My touchstone is always elements. What am I moving through when I'm explaining it to you? So does it feel thick and heavy, or does it feel cold and icy, or smooth and easy? Everything in life to me is a bit like that Tai Chi thing of moving through space.
Yeah.
And each emotion gives you a different feeling, like if you're feeling icky or if you're feeling in love. And it's like I mentioned in a chapter here, in the love chapter, something about marmalade. And I just had this thought one day, and I got up, and it's like, love is like marmalade. It is this beautiful fruit that's been taken and it's boiled down, and all of its complexities are laid out in front of you, and it's sweet, and it can be wonderful, and it can be sticky, but it's not heavy. And I think for me, it's this very tactile kind of feeling. That was a very long answer, but I hope I got it all in there for you.
That was a great answer. That's such a fun approach to writing and to like giving your emotions not just body, but like treating them as a terrain you traverse. If that makes
Yes.
sense.
No, totally, it does, and I agree with you 100%.
Oh, but on that note, Sorry to like rush a bit, but I want to
No,
make
no,
sure we
you're
have time
good.
for the audience questions. If you wouldn't
Yes,
mind
yeah,
reading some from the next.
totally. Yeah, no, so I've got, here we are. Sorry, I'm just, as I have the book in front of me, I'm trying to make sure that I hit the ones we discussed. Otherwise, I go off on a tangent. And I'm looking at my screen to see what I've flagged. The next one we had was the sodium vapor, right?
Oh, it was the one I turned to
Oh,
you.
to turn to you. Sorry,
Yes.
that was the previous one. Okay. I turn to you, put my hand on yours, smooth like silk, warm like bed. I softened and moved towards your head. I proclaim my desire like a Shakespearean fable, and then after merely a moment, put everything on the table. We kissed. It was simple. It was bliss. You had me. My heart was in your hand before you could even understand. And then we have here, trying not to. Sorry again. I wish I should have, here we go. Trying not to idolize too much, swimming in your pool, but not putting you on a pedestal. Petty, ready, steady, go. To be recognized for one's true self, past the facade and all that marmalade, sugar-covered business that can be distracting business, past the cars, seeing up and over and through all of the stars. I've sipped from your cup, but now I'm stuck, and I don't know when to give up. Is this, I think this next one is still in the love chapter. I was selfish to a point. Here we go. I was selfish to a point. 2 years past '03, then I met you, and it was you and me. Bound hip, heart and hand in hand, hand in the sand, on a beach. Tobacco is the smell of fire on your pores. Sorry. Tobacco is the smell of fire on your clothes, in your pores, it stores and stays. Ringing in your ears outside a club, I can't hear you, but I can see you clearly. And then the last one I think that I was going to read from this chapter. A complex puzzle. Centuries have tried to figure you out, but there is no figuring you out. You are, without a doubt, the biggest mystery of all. You are complex and simple and unpredictable. You are the waves, the tides, and the current, born of the sea, a complete mystery. I think that might be the last one for that chapter, Sabir. I think the next one I had here was for anxiety for the next chapter.
Oh, well, first off, thank you. Those were fantastic.
Oh,
But
thanks, Sabir. Appreciate it.
you're welcome. I'm curious how you see love. Like the poetic voice in that one, in those poems, is both sort of like yearning for love, finding safety in it, and like very much along the rest of our conversation in terms of collaboration, is trying to
Mhm.
both like communicate with the person who is loved within them.
Yes, I think a big thing in my early love stuff was ego. To be honest with you, to kind of play the antithetical, I guess, a bit to what love is. To me, I think there was a lot of ego in my love. And what I mean by that is I was placing myself on other. I was placing my desires and my energy and my anxieties on the other in the situation. And I think what I needed to do and what I ended up doing in my poetry was step back and see the person for who they are as an individual. And I think a big thing that played into that was jealousy. I talk a lot in my poems, especially to do with love, about he as self, and also he as, what if she in this case was in love with another person, and I was comparing myself constantly to, is she in love with this other person? Who is he? Well, I shouldn't compare myself to he. I think I say in one, he is not something, though I hope to be as wonderful and free, because I kept thinking that she was in love with this better version of myself that I had made up in my head. It's complex, but I think that was definitely how I came into it, because I was riddled with what I spoke about before, which was a lack of confidence in myself. Why would she be in love with me? I'm not like him, this fictional person that I made that is a better version of myself that she would surely be more in love with, if that makes sense. And then the flip side, the sort of the lovely side of love, I think for me was always a connection to the sea. There was always this things about the tides and the ocean. At the end, I talk about the sea as a complete mystery, because the sea covers more of the world, right, than land does, assumably. It's also largely the least explored part of our planet. But it's this magical thing, the tides, the currents, the fish, the ocean. It's like, it's this beautiful thing. And, when I was falling in love, when this was written, I was by the ocean. I grew up by the ocean. My partner grew up by the ocean. And it became this thing that these nets on these boats, these catamaran boats, were holding us. The air floats us and the ocean moves us. These were all kind of things that I wanted to embed. The imagery I wanted to embed in love was heavily around ocean.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. As I was reading it, the collection, I was curious if you were sort of like drawing on like Greek mythology, Aphrodite, sort of like being born of the
Yes.
ocean. Yeah,
Yes.
okay. No, that
Yeah,
makes
a lot
sense.
of that sort of stuff. I like that imagery a lot.
Huh. And then was it tricky sort of writing so personally about like either, and it's, I'm not sure if it's your current relationship or a past relationship, but just sort of
Mhm.
sharing the insecurities you had during those relationships in poetry? Like,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I do. But I also felt that it had been such an outlet to explore it and work through it and unpack it in my own mind, that I felt by the time, the point I had it on the page, in the podcast, in the book, it had actually gotten me through that period of time. So it deserved to be shown, with my
yeah,
partner, with my mum, with my parent, with my family and with my friends, and then sort of the greater community, because it was like, no, that's really important, because other people need to know that this is an outlet that actually got me through this period. I was able to sit there and go, why am I writing, she's in love with him, he's better than me, what the hell? Like, I was going, what the hell is, and then that was a way to me have that sort of epiphany moment of going, oh, I'm creating this other version of myself from my ego that's building jealousy for this other person in my relationship. But I need to be able to work through this so I can be a better person for my partner, for my friends, for my family, by separating myself from ego when I have to. And so it's a good way of working through things. It's my own little psychologist, this writing.
well, if on a like craft level, I'm a bit curious if like you when you're writing, if you go in with like a sense of intention, like I want to explore this
Yeah.
emotion or this idea, or if it just sort of organically unfolds on the page.
It has to be real, it has to be like fire, like hot whiskey in your blood. It has to be something that's just ecstasy or rage. I didn't write for the whole of this year, like 9 months of this year. And then I'm going to, if it's okay with you, I'd love to read a poem that's not in this book for the audience who've been kind enough to be here. I want to read a work that no one has read, a full length piece. But I went up recently and I quarantined to go do a job. I went and did kind of my dream job. I went up and worked with Baz Luhrmann and Tom Hanks and was taking part in this Elvis biopic, but I had to quarantine to do it. And there's a big thing for me about quarantining, like 2 weeks hotel room with my partner, locked indoors. You can't leave. And for me, I'd rather go. I could do a training camp, an army training camp in Vietnam, and I would go for it. But there was something about the four walls. What I mean by all this is I hadn't written all year. There was no moment that I felt compelled that I sat down and I went, the world, everything has changed. Like there was no moment until I got to quarantine. And I was in quarantine and I was writing. And then I came out and I was having this amazing experience on this film and I kept writing. And it was such a fruitful time for my creativity. But to hopefully answer your question in a long-winded way, but I'll come back to it, I have to be affected, as I say in my intro, in order to write. I can't manufacture. Like if I write and there's nothing there, it's terrible. Like it's honestly, I've got pages and pages of me sitting down going, come on, Dacre, write today. And I've just come to the realization and come to terms with, you can't do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes perfect sense. It has to be from a real place if it's going to not only resonate with you, but resonate with the readers.
Totally. Yes, 100%.
On that note, I'm thinking before we transition to the audience Q&A, maybe you could read that select sort of exclusive our attendees are getting.
Of course, yeah. No worries at all. I'll just pull it up here. So this is about I guess coming out of quarantine and having this amazing experience on the film. Sorry, I'm just making sure I've got. I stood in a room filled with elders, my stomach barely embers from the storm that brewed and burnt out earlier in the year. But I felt that faint rumble. I heard them here, right through the tubes in my inner ear. A room of creativity, complexity. We form a single organism, and for a moment the year disappeared. I could not hear it in my inner ear. The moment of change took tack out, but not back. I felt the rumble, the fire, the earth shook, and I faced my desire. Right there, the chorus of me, I faced you all, burning hot desire, to stand still. I played my mask and I breathed fire. And when it was over, I wept. My body had cracked spicy pepper. I wept for craft and movement in my very matter. For this is my core. I could have made them hover in time and space, lifted heart, but I was only a moment, so I had to leave my mark. As I pivot, I feel my mask slip. I straighten. I can feel the embers and ashes of those like me. We're in the womb of the living. I said to myself, these others, those, their fires too burn hot. We make mischief for a living, so I purged months of myself into a very fraction of time. And that was it.
Oh, thank you. That was fantastic.
Thanks for listening. It was nice to be able to share it.
Well, so the audience is hungry with the questions.
Oh yeah. Yes, let's do it.
Okay, so our first question is going to be from Henry, who asks, from a creative standpoint, what do you get out of working on poetry compared to what you get out of your craft as an actor?
That's a great question. I feel like poetry is the autonomy to, when I have an emotion and a feeling, to express it instantaneously. Where with acting, you're always chasing the next role, reading a script, and really the gratification isn't until you're on set shooting. Whereas poetry was something I could just go, I'm a burning hot ball of passion. I'm going to pick up something and write on it. now, and I'm going to put it all on the page now. Whereas acting is always something you're waiting for. What's next? I can't anticipate it, and it becomes very difficult to just express yourself through that instantaneously.
Thank you. Let's see. Our next question is from Anonymous, and they said, I loved your short film, Guilty Creatures. Are you planning on making something similar in the future again? I'm sorry, this is Sophia from Germany.
Yes, Sophia from Germany. Yeah, I mean, I'm loving, again, much like the first question, I'm loving the outlet of having stuff that I can have autonomy with to go and make my own content. So I definitely anticipate to be continuing to do directorial endeavors in the future.
All right, and our next question is from Liz, who asks, what advice would you give someone who is currently struggling to get started on a writing career?
I mean, I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that question, to be honest, but I, I don't know. I think just whenever you feel it, right, and also manifestation and visualization is such a powerful tool, or both of them are powerful tools. So I think it's important to do that and to write and to just continue to keep working.
I think you've also given plenty of advice throughout the conversation about how to sort of utilize your vulnerability, to how to use elements within your work, how to consider the sort of manifestations of your emotions
Totally.
physically. So
Yes.
you are qualified.
Oh, thanks, Sabina.
And then our next question is, what poem did you struggle the most with? And this is from Aaron.
That's a great question. What poem did I struggle the most with? I mean, probably, to be honest with you, poems that aren't released. I've got so many on my desktop, on my laptop here that are, you feel subconscious about. And you're like, I struggled with this so much, I don't want it to see the light of day, in some ways. So I think those are largely the ones I've struggled with the most.
I'm gonna sneak in a follow-up question. Do you think you
Yes.
have you're gonna write another collection?
I look, I'd love to. I've already written it. I mean, it's already sitting on my desktop. I've already written a whole nother book, intro, the whole lot. I mean, you have to harness it while it's there, right? So I've just made the most. And like I said, it's been later in the year that I've started writing, but I've definitely made the most. I've capitalized on really taking those emotions and using them. I had.
We have time for one last audience question, so I'm gonna make it a good one. Okay. So, hey Dacre, my name is Jess from Indonesia. I'm such a big fan, and I love your podcast. You've mentioned both in your poetry and in interviews that you faced a lot of bullying and insecurity issues, which I can sadly relate to. How long did it take you to heal from it? Does it leave a scar? Are there any rituals or activities you do that help you heal from it?
Well, firstly, thank you for being a fan. Secondly, I'm sorry to hear that you had to go through similar stuff. And lastly, I think you can definitely heal and you can get on with your life, but it is like a scar. It always is a part of you. But like I said, the start of it, I'm not sure if you were here, but at the start of this conversation, I spoke a little bit about how every part of our life makes us who we are. And it's important to own yourself. And maybe you can take that now and use that in your life, in your career, with your friends, or also to help other people who are younger going through it so that they don't have the same experience. So I think it's a very valuable tool.
Oh, I believe our host will be joining us in a second, but while we're waiting,
Amazing.
I might
Yes.
just slip in another audience question,
Yes, for sure.
which is, what was the easiest and hardest thing about writing DKMH? And this is from Maddie.
Again, I think it's just much the same in the sense that I think the easiest thing was the emotions were there and I was just pouring it out onto the page. And the hardest thing was feeling like I could share it. It took me a long time to share it.
Hello.
Hey.
That was such an awesome conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, really, really fascinating stuff.
Thanks, Sabir. I appreciate it, mate. Thank you for all the questions, everything.
Oh, it
It
was
was
great
lovely.
speaking to you. Thank you so much for just being as vulnerable and open and sharing both your work and your emotions. It was fantastic.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Tremendous thanks to both of you for having this conversation with us this evening. And to everyone watching at home, if you'd like to get an extra copy of DKMH, I just shared a link in chat, and you can also click this green button in the center bottom of your screen right next to ask a question, and I know everyone knows where that is. So yes, just look for it right there. With that, shall we adjourn?
Lovely. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you, everyone in the chat box. I appreciate it. And everyone watching. It was lovely. And I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity.
All right. Thank you so much. Everyone have a wonderful night.
Awesome. Take care.